Switch chair.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first budget session of the 2013-2014 budget year for the Joint Board of Finance, Board of Selectmen budget presentations. Everyone, please rise for a Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to ask Mr. Mayor, our Chief Fiscal Officer, to lead us in the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can I ask everybody to remain standing just for a second? I want to hold a moment of silence. We received some sad news today that former town attorney Dick Saxel's wife passed away overnight or in the early morning hours. So I'd like to hold a moment of silence in her memory. Thank you very much. Mr. Tetra, if you have occasion to speak with Mr. Saxel, please send him our condolences as a board. We worked very closely with him for a number of years and feel very sad for he and his family this evening.
I will, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for your concern.
Thank you. Yes. It's not public. Thank you. Now, I'd like to welcome everyone to the budget season, and I'd like to welcome our Board of Selectmen colleagues joining us at the table this evening. Mr. Kiley's got a children's musical event, and he'll be a little bit late tonight, but he will be joining us in process. One thing I want to talk to our board about, it's been our habit, I think we're always respectful of our presenters, and we're going to see every department head here and a lot of not-for-profit leaders here over the next 4 to 5 weeks as we go through this process. And I think it's important that we ask our questions, that we be diligent in these issues, but that we also show the courtesy and respect that we would all appreciate if we were becoming before a body of 12 individuals, as I know we will. Also, in the efforts of time, I'd like to ask that we don't ask duplicate questions unless, of course, there was an answer that someone did not understand and we need more information or a clarification to the extent that we can move it along. As we know, these nights can run rather long, as Mr. Bolito will always tell me. So I want to make sure we do that. Also, I will ask that our secretary, Mr. Brown, and that our clerk, Ms. Bassi, please take notes, particularly on the follow-up items, and if we could get those items distributed for follow-up sooner rather than later by the department heads, that'll help ease the process and move the process along as we go through these weeks. One more thing, as we like to say on this board, with the exception of Mr. Brockfeld, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if there's something that has...
It's only my first year.
So if there's something that needs to be asked, please feel free to ask it, and we'll move along. Well, we maintain structure for these meetings. We do allow, obviously, discussion, conversation, and I welcome that and welcome additional questions and add-on questions when somebody's done speaking, so please feel free to do that. And I'd like to right now extend a thank you in advance to the department heads, to the administration, to the financial department of the town, to Mrs. Gardner for all their hard work and efforts and what they've put together for us and what we look forward to seeing over the next few weeks. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Tetro, who has a presentation to make to kick us off.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I believe everybody's been given a handout of the presentation. So you have that for following along if you like. Again, thank you for the opportunity to step through and give an overview of the budget and where we stand. There are extra copies on the table up there for anyone who'd like one. Thank you, Ms. Bassi. All right, now we have got those handed out. While Fairfield continues to face a challenging economy, we also continue to show our resiliency and our strength. In the face of a superstorm and a historic blizzard, our entire town came together to help and protect each other, to provide vital services, and to recover and rebuild. In this budget for fiscal year 2014, I have two overarching goals. One is to maintain the services that our residents need and expect at a cost we can afford. And the second is to restore our town's financial stability and continue to build its foundation. There are many levels of this effort, and let me highlight the ones I consider most important. This budget does have a tax increase, driven in part by several strategic investments. The overall objective is to manage our tax burden while putting us in a position to get out from under several of our long-term expense commitments so we can reduce our budget growth in coming years. This year's budget includes funding towards restoring our financial reserves to the levels from a decade ago that were preferred by our rating agencies. And just by way of example, if you go back to 2003, you'll find that our surplus at that point was rated, was measured at 8.75% of our operating budget. That shrunk to 3.27% back in 2006 when Mr. Flynn and I joined the Board of Finance, and is up to over 5% today. So at a time when we're trying to maintain and manage our tax growth, we're not only funding our current town, but we're also trying to restore reserves. So we have the double whammy of paying for our current operations as well as some past operations. In last year's budget, we identified a series of cost drivers. Most of these commitments are still with us and have a major impact on this year's budget. However, because we address these strategically, we are beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and many of these costs are peaking this year and will begin to trend lower for future budgets. This puts us in a better position to manage and control our future tax increases. A priority in last year's budget was strengthening the town's financial foundation and flexibility. We now have removed our negative outlook and have a AAA credit rating with a stable outlook from all three rating agencies. This is the highest possible rating. This budget does not require a reduction in programs or services for either the town or the Board of Education. We have made progress with several of our labor contracts. We continue to look for improved economics and opportunities for improved productivity. We started the negotiation process with a substantial backlog. As we work through these negotiations, we want to thank everyone involved, and certainly all of our employees that participate, for understanding how much our economy has changed and having the flexibility to consider new arrangements. Our goal is to work together to make the best of current economic challenges. Our budget is based on two sources of revenue: tax revenue and non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue includes sources like golf fees, conveyance tax, building permits, state aid, etc. In this budget, non-tax revenue from all categories is relatively flat from last year, with a reduction of just over $79,000. This is compared to a non-tax revenue drop a year ago from the prior year of over $700,000. This is one of the indicators that shows while our economy isn't back yet, it may have bottomed out. On the expense side, as with the prior year's budget, it is the cost driver categories that make up the majority of the proposed tax increase. These expenses are multi-year commitments for items like debt service, retiree medical insurance, workers' compensation. The cost and rate of change can be modified or reduced over time, but not necessarily in any one year. The balance of our budget consists of town department requests, including the Department of Education, and here I am recommending approximately a $2.9 million reduction from the proposed requests. This includes $1.1 million from the Board of Education request and $1.8 million from department requests. Let me emphasize that these reductions have been made without a significant reduction in programs or services. On the education side, I do want to commend Dr. Title and his team for the plan they put together. As he explained in his presentation, health insurance costs are the major component of the department's requested increase. We now have updated health insurance projections that were not available earlier. These show a better trend enabling us to lower this expense request. This is why we can suggest a reduction in the education budget without any reduction in programs. Both the town and the school system are going out to bid on providers for both self-insurance and for full coverage. We should have these responses back shortly. While we don't know what these proposals will show, it's important to look at all the options for cost containment. Implementation of any changes would have to meet the terms of our respective labor contracts. This is one of the areas we can work to reduce costs and provide the same level of service to our employees. As we get improved information, we'll be able to refine these projections. We will make a final decision in late March as to whether further reductions are possible. On the town side, we did see workers' compensation insurance, OPEB, our retiree medical benefits, and health insurance stay relatively stable year to year. The key to managing future tax increases is to manage our cost drivers. We have focused on this effort, and starting with next year's budget, we're projecting lower growth for debt service, paving, pension, fees and professional service, and supplemental contribution to surplus. This outlook is much improved from just 2 years ago. Some of the highlights for this year include, I do want to take time to say special thanks to the department heads who have done a significant amount of work on putting this budget together and again have been very skilled at keeping cost increases to a minimum. Mr. Mayor, Linda Gardner, and the finance team have done a superb job of managing the budget process and pulling everything together. And they did it in the midst of kind of a 5-day hiatus for Storm Sandy there, or not Storm Sandy, Storm Nemo in this case. So I want to thank them for managing to get it all through. There are a number of improvements you'll see in the reporting that should help provide a clearer picture for all as we go through the process. For our seniors, we're recommending adding 2 new positions in the Human Services Department, a Senior Center Director and a part-time receptionist. These 2 positions were recommended at the Senior Center's Top 10 Committee and in their report. Seniors are an important part of our town, and we want to help them stay here. For police, we're recommending adding 3 new officers and 1 sergeant for a new school security initiative. This is part of a comprehensive plan being developed with police, fire, the school system, and the town. This budget item allows for one of the anticipated improvements in security. While the school system is the primary focal point, it's important to point out that all public facilities have security issues that need to be addressed. An example might be our library. We want everyone to have a safe environment to work and to learn. In the town plan and zoning and the building departments, we've restructured our staffing. There has been significant understaffing in both these areas, making it difficult to meet our legal and service obligations to our residents. With the ongoing work in restoring the beach area, we want to be able to improve our service levels to meet the increased demand. Our employees in these departments deserve our thanks for their taking on the extra work from Storm Sandy. These changes are needed so we can help them help us. Moving paving expense to the operating budget. We continue to increase funding for road maintenance in the operating budget with an additional $1 million this year. This is adhering to the agreement among the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and Representative Town Meeting to reduce the paving expense that had been bonded and move this expense into the operating budget. In the long run, this reduces our taxes. Improving our surplus or unassigned fund balance. One of our long-term concerns has been the low level of our unassigned fund balance. We are well below the average for AAA towns in Connecticut. It is recommended in this budget that we make an additional $925,000 supplemental contribution to the general fund to continue to move us above our current 5% level. This provides the finances and flexibility we need to meet unexpected costs. And with Nemo, Sandy, PCBs, Alfred, and Irene, we've seen way too many unexpected events in recent years. Senior tax relief. The RTM passed a much-needed enhancement to our senior tax relief program. The impact of this change is projected to be $1.2 million over current levels. The impact of this reduction is a reduction in overall tax revenue, requiring an increase in the mill rate to help make up the difference. This brings our total budget for senior tax relief to $4,550,000. Our seniors have covered and funded a lot of our town expenses over their lifetime. They deserve our support now to help them stay in Fairfield and to stay here in their homes. The bottom line, this budget represents one more year of taking our medicine to pay for past decisions and to put us in a stronger position moving forward. This budget has a 5.52% increase in expenses. However, when combined with a limited grant list growth, the senior tax relief revenue reduction, and the anticipated collection rate, we have a 6.38% increase in the mill rate. The new proposed mill rate would be 24.86. We are making progress. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We need to continue to work together on this. And our work is not done with this budget. We have a number of actions that we need to take starting as soon as this budget is approved. We can't wait till next season. The town and school system need to work together. We need to work together to find economies of scale, areas for combined and cooperative initiatives, and improve productivity from technology. I've spoken with Dr. Title, and with the approval of the Board of Education, we plan to work along with our finance teams, hopefully beginning in May, as soon as this is done. On contract negotiations, 4 of our largest cost drivers for the town are salaries, health insurance, pension, and retiree health insurance. We are continuing to work with our labor unions to find ways to manage these costs in our new economy. On debt service, Bob Mayer and our finance team recently added extensive new reporting to help us manage our debt service. We can now project the impact of new building projects and increased bonding much more readily to help with our decision-making. I also want to recognize Dr. Title for his suggestion at the recent capital planning workshop on ways to improve our school building process. On workers' compensation, this is an area that's required significant increase in funding over the past 3 years. We've now completed an assessment study, formed safety committees on both the town and Board of Ed side, and have implemented increased training programs. These initiatives should lower our costs over time. We want to take a look at other towns. We'll continue our evaluation of ways we can improve our town service levels, and we're looking at expense and revenue trends over the last 10 years for our town and also for selected group of comparison towns. We want to learn from others. We want to find best practices that we can implement here. I'd also like to propose a service evaluation committee. What services can we reduce or eliminate? As we saw last year with the adjustments made in the budget, there's no free lunch. There's no magic. If we're going to reduce costs, it really comes out to looking at what services we can eliminate or reduce. The ways to make a lasting impact is to review the services we offer our residents and determine if there are any ones that are not cost-effective or we can restructure to reduce costs. I'm going to form a committee to review a wide range of services offered by our town and to make recommendations on changes we should consider. What can we do without? How do other towns provide and fund the same service? We have a lot to learn. Talking to other towns helped us prepare for Storm Sandy. Our emergency management teams went out, looked at what other towns did, and we made changes on how we do things here. Talking to other towns helps us model our senior center, what we should provide, how to provide it, and how it's funded. This is our chance to compare services and delivery systems, a chance to ask our residents what they feel is important, and a chance to understand ourselves better. So with that as an intro, if you turn to the last page, flip over, we have the budget or cost drivers that I referred to. This is a similar format to last year. I think we tried to arrange them in sequence from the Board of Ed down through health insurance for active employees to show you the prior year budget, the first selectmen's initiative, the change, and then the percentage change, and then a percent of the total tax increase that these provide. So again, thank you for the opportunity to provide an overview of where we have. There's the budget books themselves will be here in about a week, and we'll make sure that we get those in your hands as soon as we can. So you'll have the detail that supports all this behind that.
Okay, and why are the budget books late this year, just so we go on the record on that?
I don't see anybody else jump into the podium here. It's my understanding that last year was the first year they started having meetings in February, and last year was also the first year you didn't have the budget book at your first meeting. So we're being consistent here. And with a little bit of luck, they will be here next week. Oh, excuse me. Yes, they'll be here in a week, and the next meeting is the 27th,
So they'll be here for that meeting.
so they'll definitely be here for that meeting.
Okay, so we'll have them for the next meeting that we get together.
Yeah.
Before I turn it over, the labor contracts, I know we'll go into private executive session to get an update on what's going on with those during the course of our process here. But just as we frame this, since this is one of the largest expenses in the town, please tell us which contracts are currently outstanding and for what time frame, because I just want to make sure I know, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page.
We have 3 contracts we're currently negotiating now that actually ended June 30th, 2010. That's police, DPW, and the middle management group. All right. The other 4
Yep.
are in place but end in June 30th. We have started initial negotiations with, actually, 2 of them end this June 30th, 2 end a year from then, because we negotiated a 4-year contract when we put them through. We have started preliminary discussions with the 2 units that come up in June. And the other 3 we have on, the 3 that haven't been settled yet, we have ongoing discussions.
And will those 3, will the contract that you're currently still negotiating, will those end in June, or we don't know yet, and that's part of the discussion?
That's the goal. It would be presumptuous to say
Right.
exactly where we'd be with those.
Please, go ahead, Catherine.
What are the 2 that end in June 2012?
13.
2013, sorry.
Fire
Thea.
and Thea. Thank you.
So it's possible that we're going to have 5 contracts that'll have to be negotiated starting in June, or for the period starting in July.
There would be at least 5 being negotiated during the next fiscal year.
Okay. Any other questions on this point, just before we go ahead? Again, any questions about the negotiations themselves or the impact? We'll have to wait for a private executive session so that we're not discussing strategy or what have you in public. Any questions on that? Okay. One last question, because you raised it, the insurance. You're currently looking at full insurance versus our existing program, which is self-insured, correct?
Yep. Yes, we went out to bid. It was as part of the request, if you will, for proposal. We asked for it both ways.
And-
That one of the ongoing questions has been, have you looked at both? We are, just so we can answer that question and make sure that what we're doing is the most cost-effective approach.
Could you give us a little bit about what the process is, what the dates and deadlines are over the next several weeks? Because I know you mentioned end of March, we'll be able to make an educated decision. What's going on between now and the end of March?
I think there are 2 separate data points or streams. One is, what's the current experience trend? So my reference pointed into March was that we will have updates, as we traditionally have, through the end of February at that point, which puts us in a better position. And traditionally, we make that adjustment at the end of March. So we'll have another viewpoint on that, if you will, to see where we are and to see if the positive trend continues. Separately is the bidding process. We're not sure. We anticipate it coming back at some better pricing, but we don't know that. So when that comes back, we'll take a look, and I'm going to defer to Mr. Mayor to give us an update on the timing of that.
Yeah, that's what I'm most concerned about or interested in, is what is the timing of the bid process, the leveling of the bids, and where you'll be able to make a decision on those bids.
Would it be okay if I said I don't know?
It'd be okay if that's the answer.
All of the proposals have gone out. The request for proposals went out. The proposals have all been received. They're being worked up at the moment. We anticipate getting the initial documents from Aon before the end of this month, respect to the outline and and the scheduling out of the various proposals. Then we'll go from there. The idea, obviously, is and there needs to be, as Mike, I think, mentioned, as the first selectman mentioned in his comments, to change, there has to be, in accordance with our labor agreements, which require there to be no substantial difference in delivery system. So it's not just a dollar cost evaluation, it's also a provider availability evaluation. The goal would be to have everything completed so we could be implementing, and the thing I'm drawing a blank on is either June 1 or July 1. I think it's July 1, transfer changeover date.
And would we have that information, though, as to what the recommendation is and what the financial implications are of the bid process by the time we're voting in early April?
Early April. That's the part that what I was saying. Would it be okay if I said I don't know? But that's that's a target, and we should make sure that happens. Yes.
We'll at least be able to know if we're in the ballpark,
Yes.
correct?
Correct.
When will you know, when will the bids be leveled? I know you won't be able to make a decision, but
Right.
when will you know there's some savings here or there's no savings here?
Yeah. Yeah. Or if there's adequate savings to make a
Exactly.
difference. Right. I'm hoping that we would know that by the middle of March.
By the middle of March, so we can
Right.
come back to that and revisit
Right.
that in the midst of our budget hearings.
Correct, yeah. I actually foresaw these questions and did call Aon today to confirm mine, but I did not get a return call.
Okay.
But I can get that information out to you just as.
Thank you, Mr.
tomorrow.
Mayor. Appreciate it. Does anybody have any follow-up questions on that process?
Mr. Chair, if I
Yeah.
could, just a point of information.
Sure,
When you
Mr.
said
Fitch.
early April, I think you're voting April 2nd. So very early April might be an
Right,
apt
exactly.
description.
I think that qualifies as early April, though. Thank God it's not April Fool's Day. That'd
That's
be
when the
way
Board of
too much.
Selectmen votes.
Mr. Rockwell.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on.
I'm not going to even go there.
The only other comment I'd make is, 3 or 4 years ago, there were significant differences between the contracts that the various providers had with physicians. Based upon my understanding of the marketplace, that gap is closed significantly. I am not foreseeing a significant, I could be wrong, I am personally not foreseeing a significant potential savings from a switch, but we'll know for sure.
Thank you. Mr. Brockville?
I think, Mr. Mayor, partially, and I have to admit, part of this is a question about understanding, but I think it's important for us to understand, and this is addressed to you, Mr. Mayor, what exactly are we bidding out, or are we trying to change because, or get better prices on? 'Cause the way I understand it, and I apologize, I probably don't understand it totally, is that we're self-insured with some sort of stop loss in case somebody gets really, really sick, and then it's over 125,000 or something like that. So if we're self-insured, right, I mean, so are we bidding out the stop loss policy, the catastrophic policy? What are we bidding out?
Well, the stop loss policy is something that's looked at each year, but basically there's 3 or 4 major carriers in the marketplace: Aetna, United, and Anthem. Those providers have different hospital contracts, different provider contracts, different lab contracts, and they go through cycles when one of them may or may not have better dollar value contracts with provider groups than the other. So if you get like 1%, 2% difference, 3% difference, we're talking, our total healthcare costs like $40 million. So 1% is what, $400,000 or something like that. If you get that, plus there's also sometimes they get competitive on their administrative fees, so we pay for administration. But we're constantly paying attention to the stop loss, because that's something that fluctuates.
So that basically, that's,
But there's one more, if
I
I
have one
heard
other
you
point, yeah.
correctly, there's one other point there, though,
Yeah.
too, which is an actual change from at least evaluating going from self-insured to fully insured.
Generally speaking, you would pay more going fully insured,
I understand.
but that people do bring up the question, why aren't you? So I think the administration, both the Board of Administration and Town Administration, made a decision to go both ways to see what the numbers come in at.
Yep. Thank you.
can I follow? Yeah.
Please.
And I think you also answered the question, but I'll ask it because I think it's important. Are we, in addition to asking what the full insurance model would cost, and I think you're right, most likely it's going to be more than the self-insurance, are we also putting on the table an HSA model with an HSA account and so forth for the employees, or would that be substantially different and require negotiations?
Do we have, oh, department heads only, yeah, department heads, I guess, have an SHA. I know I saw an SHA model somewhere, I couldn't remember where it was, yeah. No, it's not something that's been discussed for the, I mean, that doesn't fit with the union contracts.
Say that again?
That doesn't fit with the union contracts.
Doesn't fit the union. You have a cold, so I can't hear you.
What we have to do is, Mr. Raphael, what we have to do is bid the program substantially the same as
That
to what
was
we
my
have.
question.
Right,
So
so
it's-
that's what we're doing. We're bidding it substantially the same as to what's in the contracts now. Otherwise, it takes an entire round of negotiations beyond that to
Okay.
check that.
Okay, so just to square the circle, so an HSA model, to both of you, probably, you believe wouldn't fit the similar?
Definitely
I
would not.
think that, and the simplest thing to do for any more substantive questions on the insurance in terms of what would be to ask those when our insurance reps are here, so you have it straight from the horse's mouth.
Mrs. Albin, you had a comment?
If
Which I
my
think is
memory
next week.
serves
That's
me
fine.
correctly, I believe there is an option for employees in the Board of Education side, within those bargaining units, to take an HSA if they want, but it's not required of them. And I believe that was negotiated in the last round, if not the round before that.
Mrs. Leclerc, you had a follow-up?
Yeah. Since you just told us you're negotiating with 5 unions, wouldn't you want to know the costs of potential, like if it's a potential savings for an HSA plan? So you know if that's something you want to negotiate in your next round of contracts?
We're walking a fine line here on getting into negotiating strategy, but let me answer it as best I can. For the contracts we're negotiating that expired virtually 3 years ago, we've missed the window
Right.
on what items we can bring up for negotiation without being charged with unfair labor practices in terms of regressive negotiation or something it's called. So the areas that we're negotiating have been defined.
But it
So-
is something
Three
that
of
could be
them.
for
So
the future.
From a standpoint of future, as I mentioned, we're looking at a host of options that would provide better economies for the town and provide service to our employees. So the broad answer is yes. The current answer depends on whether it's been brought up in the contracts previously and whether we're allowed to introduce new items at this point.
Okay.
Any other comments, questions? So any other questions, comments on the presentation as a whole for Mr. Tetro before we start on specific items?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tetro, just your line on page 6, that this budget represents one more year of taking our medicine for past decisions. Could you just be a little specific? What
Well-
past decisions are we talking?
Oh, certainly. One of the examples I brought up was that we had an 8.75 surplus at one point, percent of our operating budget. We drew that down to 3.5%, 3.37%, and now we're taking time to build it up. So we're sitting here in one of the toughest economies when we're trying to manage taxes, and we're in essence paying for money we used to fund budgets in prior years. So we're double paying, if you will. We're paying for past years and we're paying for currently. If I look at paving, we went through a number of years where we didn't fully fund paving. Then we made a commitment to fund $3.5 million per year, and we're now moving it over. So at the same time that we're trying to manage tax growth, we are moving things that were bonded into our operating budget, which in the short term increases taxes. In the long run, it's good because we're no longer paying for the expense plus interest over a number of years. But right now, if you look at it, we're paying for the current paving expense in this year's budget, plus we're still paying on the stuff we bonded from a few years ago. So that's what I'm referencing, and with respect to that. If you look at our surplus, let's take an example of last year's, the fiscal 13 budget we just passed. It was a 4% tax increase last year. We put $2 million into our internal service fund to boost up the reserve there because we hadn't funded that properly. Another $500,000 in our surplus. That's $2.5 million. That represents a 1% increase. Right? So instead of our tax increase being 3% to fund last year's current budget, it was 4% fund last year's plus what we had to put back in for money we used to fund prior year's operations. So that's what I mean about past decisions we made and looking at that. And at some point, we have to pay the piper. Unfortunately, we're paying the piper now.
Right. So then, just to follow up with that, you mentioned that you feel we've peaked in a lot of these cost drivers, or some of them, right? So which you mentioned some of them, but which other ones would you say we've peaked? and start to see a trend moving lower over the next couple of years?
Let's take it just right from the top.
Yeah.
The Board of Ed had a substantial increase in their budget this year due to their health insurance costs. Now, health insurance, you have to plan on going up every year, but you don't have to plan on going up the same rate that the experience showed for the Board of Ed. It looks like we're seeing a better trend right now, so we can hope that that number would not be as high next year. Pension. We know that had a substantial increase this year, and we know based on our projections, the increase won't be anywhere near that. Debt service. We know that went up 1.6 this year. It goes up next year, but I think about 200,000. Again, we just covered that in our capital planning workshop, so we should see a reduction in growth there. Paving, we're done with our 3-year plan of converting over to the budget, so instead of $1 million, that goes to 0 in terms of additional paving there. Fees and professional services, some of that's going up because of increased warranty costs and software costs in IT. Some of that's going up because of legal services. We'll go through the details of all that. But part of that's some of the cuts we made in legal services last year. If we don't make those cuts this year, then that number shouldn't be adjusted. Supplemental contribution to surplus, if we get that to the 925, then we can have it stay at that level for the next few years. So that won't be going up from there. Workers' comp, OPEB, and health insurance. Workers' comp, I mentioned a number of the initiatives we have here to keep that under control. And again, with something like that, there's not a guarantee. Any day a catastrophic incident can take place and that number can go through the roof. But we think we put the right programs in place to manage that, so there's an expectation that hopefully that won't happen. OPEB, really a function of insurance. We're fully funding the ARC now. We got up to that in the fiscal 213 budget. So that should be a year-to-year increase as opposed to, it was going up at 25% a year or multiple millions of dollars until this year. And health insurance, we've had 2 years of good experience. There is no guarantee that that's going to be flat next year for sure. And I think in general you have to project that's going to be up a bit. There's no magic formula there. But there's a number of these others that are going down. We hope that'll compensate and we can keep these in a reasonable range.
Thanks. Thank you.
Can I, anybody else? 'Cause if not, I want to follow up. A couple of points on this. Let's go back to a couple of comments that the first selectman made. Last year, we put in $2 million in the internal service fund to try to shore that out. Unfortunately, I think the latest projections we have is that $2 million has been used up, right? So we really, although we put the $2 million in, we really haven't made the dent in that we would like. Obviously, we're better off than we would have been had we not done it, but I don't think we got the desired impact we all had hoped that we had gotten.
We kept from falling behind.
Right.
Yeah, Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
we now have our healthcare insurance through January,
Right.
and that shows significant improvement on the Board of Ed side.
Right.
And that internal service fund includes Board of Ed and town.
Sure.
So the next document that you see with that will be better than the last document you
Right.
saw.
But not as good as we had hoped when we put the $2 million in there.
Not as good as we'd hoped, but
Right.
better than last time we talked about it.
Right. And then we also put $500,000 into the undesignated fund balance, right? But the numbers I saw, and I can't find them somewhere here, but in essence, we're making a marginal improvement, nothing meaningful. I mean, it's 1/10 of a point, or it might even be lower. It was going down 1 year, and now I might be going up a little bit, right?
Yeah, that's actually one of the budget items, agenda items
One
for
of the
today.
items we're going to see tonight.
Yes,
right. So we're
yes.
not really going up there.
We're going, I mean, it's
It went down, and now if we put the 925 in, I think it's going up a little.
yeah, well, it actually, you're probably referencing Mr. Centofanti's comment or presentation where you someone.
You're quite true. You're quite
Right. There, you know, that distressed me because if you remember, not a couple of months ago, we had presented to you a schedule that showed it going up a little bit.
Right.
So
Okay, but
Ms. Bossy and I looked at that number, and the determinations made, and we talked to Mr. Centofanti, and he had mixed and matched a little bit, and his number was mistaken.
Okay, so let's look at this,
So-
though.
But
Thank
we
you,
can look
Mr.
at the,
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Let's look at this, though. Let's go to the budgetary basis on the fund balance analysis real quick.
right, and that's just very, this is probably the first time you've seen a budgetary basis plus GAAP basis.
Right.
As
Look
two
at-
different items. He had mixed and matched these, and that's why,
Okay, but they're both
Got it.
going down. If you look at fiscal year 2012, we were at 5.56. Fiscal year 2013, at the end, we're going to be at 5.54. That's
Right,
budgetary basis.
right.
going
his-
down.
Yeah, his schedule had showed it going down in 12.
That's fine.
Right. Yeah, obviously, to maintain your current percentage, you have to increase your surplus,
That's
your
correct.
supplemental contribution by the same percentage that the budget is going up.
Right. So if
And
we
and
look
so,
at,
yeah, so we hopefully will have, an excess variance a little bit at the end of this year that will make this up so it won't go down, but, it's, who knows?
yeah, but both budgetary and GAAP right now, current projections based on budget say we're going down,
Correct,
even though we put the additional 500,000 in.
correct.
And then we're putting 925 in based on this budget. And by the way, I'm not making a determination, an assessment of that, but it's basically going up. It goes from 5.54 projected this year to 5.58 projected next year. And it's going from 5.23 this year to 5.28 next year on a GAAP basis. So it's a marginal improvement. And as our budget continues to go up, as you just said, we're going to have to continue to put more in there.
Yes, sir.
And I said a key word earlier, and I used it, Mr. Tetra used it in his discussion, hope, right? Hey, we hope this happens, we hope that happens, we hope this happens, we hope that happens. Hope isn't a strategy. And what we're coming to realize now is that we actually need to, unfortunately, look at some of the services we're providing. I've been saying this for quite some time. I've said it at some RTM meetings and others have said it on this board as well. As we get crowded out here by these costs, the costs of providing these services are affecting the affordability of the town. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we continue to try to provide these services, and surprise, surprise, the cost continues to go up each and every year. So I think it's very important that the town bodies get together and determine what services can the town afford to continue to provide versus what we can no longer afford to provide, given all the other drivers that are here that are, I don't want to say beyond control, but are not fully within our control based on the state in which we live, the unfunded mandates which get passed, and what's perceived as the relative financial strength of our town as compared to other communities, and what that does to us as we go to address those financial concerns. So we're really boxed in here because I've been on the board for 8 years. Mike, you were on the board here for 6 years. Mary, I won't say how long you've been on the board, but you've been on the board a while. And Mr. Kiley, you've been here since, what, the Stone Age or so. And-
Mr. Mayor served 6 years on the
And
board,
Mr. Mayor served 6 years on the board.
and Mr. Stone is coming up on completing his
Right.
6th year. Sounds like he's getting a PhD here, sir.
Right. The bottom line is, each and every year we sit here and we say it's a difficult budget year. And each and every year we sit here and say, well, this will get better next year or this year or the year after. And each and every year we're sitting here with the same set of facts. Different numbers, same facts.
Yeah, I think two things, Mr. Flynn. One is I think identifying that the cost drivers made a big difference. I think we all were aware that this year would be more challenging than last year, based on if nothing else, the pension projection alone that we knew was coming.
Absolutely.
And I also think that's why that part of my message at the end is say, here's the action items we have to do to take further steps. We can't just sit back and wait for next year and then see how the budget's going. There are things we have to do in the interim, because to your point, if we don't change how we're looking at these things, if we don't make some structural changes, we're just sitting back here riding along with it, and that's no longer acceptable. In this economy, we can't do that.
And are the department heads willing to come before us this year and discuss what structural changes they can make that aren't baked into the numbers that can help us evaluate these numbers further?
I think it's reasonable to ask that. I don't think they're prepared to do that. And I think to some degree, and
Right.
conversation we had at breakfast the other day.
Right.
We have got a number of very good department heads that can optimize what's going on in their department.
Right.
The issue is you have to cross department lines to make the next level change.
Right.
And that's what we have to bring them together for. We've got tremendous talent in this town, and what I'm trying to do with the Service Evaluation Committee is tap that. We've got people that have done turnarounds, have run companies, have got that skill set. We want to get some of that group in, looking both at what other towns do, because other towns aren't all organized the way we are. And the nice thing about the public sector is we're not in competition with other towns directly, so you can go down and share. When we've had questions on how things work, we've been able to go visit Greenwich. We've been able to go visit Trumbull and say, how do you do this? Step us through it. And we've been able to take those lessons back here. So I think there's a greater sense of urgency now. And I don't mean to belittle any efforts in past years, but I think that when you look at a 6% increase, that creates a certain sense of urgency that we've got to change this. As we talked, as Mr. Brown's question pointed out, there are a number of these drivers that we fully expect to go down. There are too many of those that we can say we're doing all the right things, but we're not fully in control of those, as you pointed out.
Right,
So if we don't take action, workers' comp being one,
right.
we are taking the actions that we can take to make sure that's under control, but I can't guarantee you what that number is going to be next year.
Right.
The only thing we can do is go back out, look at services, and to the extent that we can restructure, modify, or eliminate services, we can then eliminate costs.
Right. And I think that's, does anybody else have a comment on this? Mr. Bolito, did you have?
Well, not this specifically, but
I have one on this.
Please.
And I guess we're, at this point, I think we're talking in the big picture before we
We
go.
are.
Okay, so, I agree with everything the two of you just went back and forth on. I'm just as concerned, and we've had conversations both publicly and privately, and everybody else on the board. And I think that, I guess what my question to Mr. Tetro is, and I apologize because I don't know how developed this is or where you stand, but this idea of a service evaluation committee, I'm greatly in favor of, because I think that the only way we're going to tackle the kind of things we're talking about here is in some sort of town-wide conversation, if you will, because every item that is a service that you mentioned, Tom, has a narrow but probably very strong constituency. And so unless we attack this in a town-wide fashion, there's no way to do it because, a very vocal group of small vocal group can drive the conversation when most people in town are too busy to even be involved with this stuff here. So I guess my question to Mr. Tetro is, what are your plans, if you have them at this point, for that committee? How widely do you plan to spread it out? Who do you, I'm not talking about the names, but where do you plan to draw from to put this committee together? From the Board of Finance, the RTM, from the public? Do you, how do you plan to set this thing up?
Yeah, the goal at this point would be to draw from the public. I think we've got some tremendous talent out there, and I think if you're looking for a fresh perspective, you want people that have a fresh perspective and don't have the baked-in assumptions, perhaps, that folks that are involved with the departments are in the process. At some point, you've got to vet it against everybody, so I think that it's probably a multiple-step process, and that far through, I haven't thought it.
Okay.
Haven't thought it all the way out. But I think the goal of there are too many people I've talked to over the last year that are very concerned about the town, have got some phenomenal skill sets and experience in terms of what they bring to the table. They're missing some of the specifics in terms of getting involved. So the question is, how do we bring new people into the process, how we take advantage of the tremendous management talent we have in town, and get some of our priorities reset or at least evaluated.
Well, I, for one, would strongly recommend we move on that as quickly as we can.
I'm going to go to Ms. McCarthy Vahey because she's got a question specific to this. Comment. Do you have?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there's no question that we have to have different kinds of conversations at this point. And I think that I agree with Mr. Tetro, certainly in the fact that we have tremendous resources. I also think that we have tremendous resources within our boards. And it occurred to me after leaving our capital planning workshop the other day, that in talking about the big picture view with capital items, that's something that perhaps a parallel process even among these boards that might parallel any separate group. While we discuss the budget, we're looking at this specific budget. We're looking at the next fiscal year. We're looking at the specific line items. So it also might be helpful and interesting to have a conversation here with this group in looking at the big picture multi-year, similar to what we do with the capital planning that would parallel that, which then I think addresses the opportunity to bring in that outside talent, so to speak, but also allows for us to do that in tandem. So just something to consider.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Brown and then Mrs. Alman.
Look, just a comment on what you said, Mr. Flynn, which, just in my opinion, I mean, I agree with the statement that you made 100%. It makes me think of the audit, though, that we had 3 years ago.
Yep.
We brought an outside auditor in 2010. The town did, and so did the Board of Ed. And they did a thorough job. They went through every department. They presented the report. We spent $50,000 just on the town for
Yep.
that audit. But in the end, there really wasn't any big revelation.
Yep.
Nothing really changed because they didn't recommend any changes. What they said was, with this model, you're running this about as efficiently as you can. I mean, I think with the town, they said you might have a couple $100,000 worth of cuts. But that's with the model that we're with currently. So with this committee, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is the only way we can slow down the increases is there's going to have to be some significant changes, which is going to bring out some pain and a lot of discussion, because it's not going to be easy. And I'm not sure what the model would look like. I obviously don't know what the recommendations would be, but I do know that we spent $50,000 and basically they didn't come up with anything worth, really worth discussing beyond. I don't think we ever talked about the audit again. Maybe internally you did within your administration. But do you want to make a comment before I continue?
If that's okay, Mr. Chair?
Please.
Yeah, I guess, Mr. Brown, in thinking back on the audit, I wasn't impressed with what they did. We sat here in this board, and they recommended hiring more firefighters to cut down on overtime. We asked them to show us the cost analysis on how they figured the pension and OPEB and benefit costs into all that, and I don't ever remember getting a response. I think Mr. DeWitt asked that, if I remember correctly. Second, I've yet to see a report of any substance that came into an organization like Town Hall and didn't come up with a single recommendation that technology could be used for improved productivity in any area. So I guess I'm looking back at that, and I wasn't impressed with what we did. I think a twofold issue there. I think, one, maybe we didn't put enough financial resources into getting a thorough job done. And I think, I guess the way I'd phrase it here is that I'm personally committed, the administration's committed to making changes on this, and I think that it starts, you've got to have a group that is managing the organization that's committed to making change. Otherwise, outside recommendations are never going to get you the right answers.
Right. So I agree with that. Just to follow up with that, it's the model that we have, but we also have to, I think, look at other revenue sources other than the residents of the town. Commerce. We have this metro station. What are we going to do with this metro station? What businesses can we bring in to Fairfield, which is in a great location, and to drive up revenue to help offset these costs to relieve the pain on the taxpayer? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mrs. Alban, and then I think Mr. Stone had his hand up.
On that note, Mr. Brown, we should have been talking earlier because your comments on extra revenue are exactly where I was going. Fairfield, over the years, Fairfield has been a great town for a very long time, longer than I've lived here, which is close to 30 years. And like many places or organizations that are very good, they're successful at what they do, so they try to do it better. And Fairfield has spent decades doing it better. And if you provide something and someone says, that's great, gee, have you thought of this? And you add it to your repertoire of what you offer. So to the point that Mr. Flynn has made, we do need at some point to look at what is it that we want Fairfield to be in the 21st century. And what one person will find valuable, someone else won't. That will be a problem. To Mr. Brown's point, if we change the face of Fairfield, it won't be without some pain. So we're going to have a discussion at some point in time, because we may not see this type of an increase next year because some of the drivers may not be there. But there may still not be the appetite for the increases that will be necessary to continue to run this machine, this enterprise that we have. Because, quite honestly, we don't have enough income coming into this town beyond taxpayers, property taxes. And so as part of looking at our services, is there any effort, is there any possibility of spearheading something that will bring more commerce into town, that will bring some commercial revenues? Because if we're going to continue, in my opinion, to provide the services that we are accustomed to having here, the burden can't lay solely on the backs of the property taxpayers. And so while we look at services, if we change them, if we reduce them, that would be one step. If we decide we want to keep them all, we're going to have funding for it beyond just the property taxpayer.
Mr. Tetro, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, if I might, just building on the discussion line from earlier in terms of some of the costs that we are paying for now and hadn't paid for fully perhaps in past budgets. One of the things that masked where we were doing, if you look at the last 10 years, we had almost twice the amount of dollars coming in on conveyance tax that we do today. We had significantly more dollars coming in on building permits and conservation permits, golf fees. You can go down our entire list of fees and realize that for about 10 years there, we rode the economy, and that masked some of the cost factors we had going up. The good news part of looking at our non-tax revenue being flat is that we have to face up to that and realize that this is a cost problem, not just a revenue problem. And I think we certainly need to look at both, but I think we have to solve the cost side of the equation to have any lasting impact.
Mr. Stone?
I really don't have anything to add. I think everything's been said, but I think it's this is something that needs to be done. It's I think we're on the right track. My one fear is that we come up with great recommendations, and as Mr. Brown said, they don't get implemented. I keep thinking of even in Washington, Simpson Bowles. I think of the audit committee that we had. I remember I was part of that. I remember the Board of Ed. There were certain recommendations that this committee put forward, and the Board of Ed had an answer for everyone, every single one, and none of them were implemented. Yeah. So that's what I'm afraid of. But I think it's really important to get the town people and the intelligent town people that know what they're doing involved.
Mr. Chair, if I
Yes.
Just, I think one of the differences between here in Fairfield and even the state or federal level is we're all here, we're all neighbors. This is our town. And I think we have much more ownership of that, and I think that's what's going to help us get things done as opposed to what happens in D.C. and the gridlock that we watched there go on for years.
You know, one of the things we've tried to do in the last number of years on this board, and it's been a concerted effort of all of us, is think more strategically than tactically. Because a lot of times what we found is that the discussions become over 10 police cars versus 11 police cars, 1 fire truck versus 2 fire trucks, how you're stocking the supplies. Those things don't move the needle. In order to impact real change and real economic difference to these cost drivers, it's a strategic discussion over how you're doing things. Now, I agree with Mr. Brown to the point of that audit, although I don't think it was done as well as it could have been done, and it certainly didn't address things like technology and things like that, and the opportunities were there, showed that by and large, when compared to other municipalities and other governments, we were pretty efficient. Now, I would argue that's not a high bar.
With this model.
Right. And that's why I said we need to think more strategically. And that's why I referenced the fact of the definition of insanity. If we're going to continue to have these tax increases year after year, there's a whole new way of thinking that needs to happen. And we need to evaluate all the services we provide and A, whether we should be providing them, number one. B, is there someone else that can provide them better, more efficiently? And C, for those that we're saying we're providing, are we providing them as efficiently as we possibly can? And those are the items that we need to address strategically in order to move these numbers. Because although I agree that certain of these numbers are going to come down, I could see others that'll just continue to go up if we continue to do things the same way. And that scares me, because I've been on this board for 8 years, and I've yet to see an easy budget year. And I see that we've made a lot of difficult choices here. And Mr. Tetra, to your point earlier, we've attempted to address the long-term financial issues, the surpluses, the capital plan, the OPEB, the trust funds, right? The insurance issues. Other bodies have looked at senior citizen tax relief. They've looked at labor negotiations. There's been a lot of heavy work and a lot of water carried. And guess what? We're looking at a 6%. And that scares me. So, does anybody have anything else to add? Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is something that might segue us a little bit into the next topic, which is revenue, and it's something that
Yep.
was alluded to by Mrs. Albin and Mr. Brown, which is the commercial tax base. As bad as the economy is, certain towns in the area, you think Stamford, you think Norwalk, you think Shelton, maybe to a lesser extent Wilton, seem to have been successful in attracting corporate investment, regional headquarters for banks, television networks, things like that. And when I look at Fairfield, I haven't seen that level of success. I see a town that has a vast amount of resources. Certainly we have as much to offer, if not more, than those other towns. So what I'd like to know is, Mr. Tetra, what is your plan going forward specifically to attract more corporate and commercial investment into Fairfield and to move the needle on the commercial tax base in this town, which relative to other towns is pretty low?
Actually, I think if you look at the facts, you'll find that that's not the case. Let's take a look at if you look at Fairfield County, the average vacancy rate across those towns is 20 to 25%. In Fairfield, it's 5 to 8%. So we have more to offer, and businesses have recognized that by filling it up. You go to any other town, you drive down Main Street in Greenwich, you'll find a lot of vacant stores. You won't find the buzz you do here on Saturday. Now, the type and the mix of business is also different. We have a lot more smaller businesses that make that up. If you look at where we can put major companies, there's really only 2 places. One is the Exide factory, and that's currently not available until we get Mill River cleaned up, and so that's a few years off. But a developer is chomping at the bit to develop that. If you look at the Metro Center, that site is in direct competition with the Stanfords, with the Norwalks, all right, with their 25% vacancy rate, and already built buildings to a great degree. So they are definitely a very competitive offer. Somebody can move in much sooner than the 2-3 years it would take to move in here at much cheaper rents. That's the trade-off people have made in doing that, at least in terms of talking to the developer. The developer is also in a situation where, since unlike the movie Build It and They Will Come, he has to find somebody who's going to come before he can build it. So that from that standpoint, if you're trying to build a 150,000, 200,000 square foot building and you need a keystone tenant, you need somebody who's going to come in with 100,000 square feet or more. there are only so many of those that are willing to move and kind of wait 3 years for that move to take place. So that's one of the challenges, and it's the developer's property. So while we're more than happy to help and do everything we can, I think you've seen the developer to some degree, based on recent presentations, identify two things. He really wants to go with residential, not commercial, which doesn't help long-term because we only have so much commercial development space in Fairfield. And second, he had some rather compelling stats on how tough the commercial market is for companies in that side, the net jobs that weren't created, that type of thing. In spite of that, we still have a lot of what I'll call smaller developments that are being proposed all around town. We've had a number of very visible ones get turned down by our Planning and Zoning Board rather than letting those go through. So when we talk about working, we have to work with all the different segments of our governing bodies to get those through. I believe there's some new proposals going up for what was formerly the I. Brown property, which was formerly one of our blighted properties, which we actually collected over $38,000 in blight fees on recently. And it was currently bought by a new developer. I think he's going to be coming before the appropriate boards with a new plan that hopefully will get that off the mark. There's some property that up on Park Avenue that folks looked at. I think St. Vincent's looked at developing part of that into a medical facility, but that raised the ire of the neighborhood. So that they weren't comfortable with that type of development going in there. So it's something we have to balance between all those groups, but we've got Mark Barnhart certainly back on the job. We've got the Economic Development Commission more revitalized. I've met a couple times with them, and they're looking at being much more outspoken in terms of that. And we've got a tremendous story here to tell. I mean, we saw that during Restaurant Week in terms of what took place. We look at the restaurants that are coming into town. We look at how quickly vacant commercial space is getting picked up and turned over. So I think there's a tremendous story. We're not going to double our commercial tax base without Exide and the Metro Center being developed. We'll continue to grow it, but we only have X amount of vacancies within our current built-out space. We don't have as much, I believe it's what's called grade A commercial space, as say a Stanford does, or Norwalk with their Merit 7.
Yep.
But as soon as we can get Exide, the property across the street from Exide, which is under development, right across from Martell's there, as well as the Metro Center, I think those will be the two next big boons for us on the commercial side.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Tetreault. I appreciate the discussion, and I think you make a lot of valid points. As far as the vacancies go, I would disagree with you on that. We might have a lower percentage of vacancies, but if you look at the fact that the landlords who own those buildings are still making their tax payments, that's not really moving the needle neither here nor there as far as revenue coming to the town. There are a significant amount of vacancies in Fairfield. If you drive along Kings Highway and other places, it may not be to the level of certain other towns, but in terms of impacting revenue, I don't agree that that's really a major impact. When you speak about the Metro Center, when you speak about Exide, I agree that these are not things that are going to happen overnight. To a certain extent, they are tied up in the plans of private developers. What I haven't seen, and I guess what I would like to see, is some concerted effort on the part of the town to work with these developers, as repugnant as that may be in some cases, to go out and sell the town to anyone who will listen, understanding that nothing's going to be built there within a year or two, but, you know, some corporations, some banks are looking 2 or 3 years down the line. And if we have some sort of concerted effort that, look, we have a developer that's got this land, we have a town government that's willing to work with this developer, and you go down to visit any CEO and singing Kumbaya hand in hand, again, as difficult as that may be, that's what I'm missing, and that's what I'm seeing from other towns like Norwalk and like Stanford. They seem to be out in front selling the town, advocating for the town. And maybe it's a matter of just my perception, and I might be wrong, but it doesn't seem like we had that same level of selling and going out there with these developers to develop those remaining spaces that could be the home of GE Capital, that could be the home of, you know, the National Geographic Channel or whatever other opportunities are out there. Again, it's that cooperation and concerted effort that I think has been missing. And I'm not saying it's the town's fault. I'm not saying it's your fault. Understand that they're private developers with their own means and motives, but it does seem like we're on the sidelines a little bit too much, and perhaps we should redouble our efforts to get out there and get the word out there that you need to be in Fairfield, you need to be at the Metro Center, and this is why.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Blair, one, I guess simply put, I'm not sure you're aware of everything that is being done.
That's
So,
true.
so from that standpoint, I would respectfully disagree with some of your comments. I think we have been working with both Fairfield University and Sacred Heart to kind of develop a strategic partnership, much to Mr. Flynn's earlier comments, and much like a research triangle kind of concept. What are your departments? What are you good at? What do you want to be good at? What businesses should be working with you to attract to this area? So that's kind of one component. Second, I think that it also depends on where the development is and the type of development. From a simple standpoint, if the building's built, it's a lot easier to go out and sell the building, work with the brokers, because it's there. There's no hidden agendas, and
agree, yeah.
there's nothing that the developer, if you will, is keeping confidential. When you're still trying to build a building, that becomes a much longer term and much more strategic selling, and the developer may not be as open with what his prospects are as early in the process as you might think.
Understood. And I'm glad to hear you mention that research triangle thing, and frankly, that's something that if I were you, I'd want to publicize more, because that's the type of thing that creates a buzz and creates, the idea that something's going on. And I'm glad that stuff like that's happening. Let's have more of it. Okay?
All right, any other questions, comments?
Yes.
Mr. Mayor
Yes.
and Mr. Kiley?
Mr. Flynn, thank you.
go, Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Tetro just touched on a topic that is, very near and dear to my heart, and it's about the Metro Center. The building is not built. And, we have this, we have this conundrum where we have a developer who has a piece of land that we can't do much about, so I don't know the solution to that. But what I do know is that that is one of two, maybe even one of one, depending on how the cleanup of Exide actually goes over the next few years. But that is at least one of two, if not one of one, of the only places in town where we could do anything creatively, an RTP type situation, an office park type situation that would be attractive to businesses across the whole Gold Coast. The problem is we have a developer who does not have the financial ability or the vision or the desire to build the buildings. And I don't know how we change that situation. That is the problem. And now they're talking about putting apartment complexes over there. That would be a horrible mistake if this town allowed that to happen. I think we should fight that tooth and nail, 24 hours a day. It's bad for the town. It's bad for the town long term. It's bad for the town short term. And it creates more expense on this town than it does revenue. So we need to find a way to get that piece of land developed and built, because Mr. Tetro is correct. It is a hard sell to go sell a concept. We're going to build this if you come. And everyone looks at you and says, well, these other guys actually have places for me to go to, so why should I even talk to you? It makes it a very difficult battle. So until we have a developer who's willing to partner with us, put some skin in the game, spend some money, or sell the property to another developer who can actually do something with it, then we're not going to solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Mr. Mayor, you had a comment.
I had a question, actually, with reference to Ms. Bleel's comments. With respect to commercial property, isn't the tax basis based upon income generation rather than property value? And therefore, vacancies do make a significant difference.
I'm not exactly sure you're right. I understand what you're saying, but I think it has an impact in terms of when you have vacancies, the developer's ability to get financing to continue owning the buildings, that certainly is affected. But as far as what makes up the tax base, honestly, I'm not sure.
I think, and we'll close this off, the point on the commercial versus residential, which would be an interesting data point, is what is our commercial percentage versus residential percentage versus some of those other towns? And I don't know the answer to that as I sit here right now.
As a tax
Yeah.
component?
Yeah.
I think it's 85-15, isn't it?
I thought that's what ours were. It'd be interesting to benchmark that against.
I think we've got a
some
couple
the
of
other
benchmark
towns.
points out there
Yeah.
that may help with that.
We looked at that a few years ago. I'd
Yeah,
like to look
I
at
think
it
we have
again.
I think we have some current data on that we can
Yeah.
provide.
Which would
And
be
in
very
terms of the assessment and how the taxes work, I think that might be a good follow-up question for Don Ross when he's here. But I believe Mr. Mayor's right. It's a function of income and expenses for the building in terms
Yep.
of commercial property, how it's done. It's not a residential sale model where you look at comps.
And let's get both answers to those questions, because I think they are interesting follow-up items. They are something, at least the second one, commercial versus residential. What I'm interested in personally is what's our benchmark versus some others. Because we obviously do look at commercial versus residential each and every year, but we haven't looked at it benchmarked against other towns for a little bit of time, because I think actually we were waiting for the Metro Center and some other items. With that, does anybody have any questions or comments on the rest of Mr. Tetro's presentation? Okay, I thank you for that. I'm going to ask for a 5-minute break, and then we're going to go right into revenue, debt service, and fund balance. Thank you. 5-minute break. Into session. With this in mind, we'll go to second item on the agenda, if I can find it, which is revenue. So I'm going to turn this over. Mr. Mayor, the one thing that was missing from the package, and I know the books weren't going to be ready, is an actual explanation of some of the larger differences on the revenue side from year over year. So I think you're going to have to walk us through those.
Yes, sir. Couple quick comments before we start.
And I hope you feel better, by the way. You don't sound good.
I sound worse than I feel, so thank you very much, though. State revenue, state aid is in here flat. And the reason it's in here flat is because the governor's office has indicated that he's holding everybody harmless, all municipalities harmless. There are, however, there has been some reallocation. There's approximately a $656,000 reduction from the state in general fund kind of activities.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, which sheet are you working off of right now?
I'm sorry, what?
Which sheet?
I'm not. I'm talking.
Okay, thank you.
All right, no. I'm saying, so, but I mean, there are line items. I'm talking about the state in general. Yeah, so state general fund revenues are down about 656. However, there's two areas. Town aid road is one, and the other is the LoCIP, Local Capital Improvement Program. Those two combined are up about 356,000. And the information that's come out of the governor's office has indicated that that those two line items can be used for operational items. And we haven't actually read, I have not actually read the language in the report, but we've taken the governor's office at face value, his information at face value. But I think one thing I can positively say about the budget, it's a work in progress. And obviously, everyone should feel free to ask any and every question, and we'll do our best to bring back answers following meeting. So state revenue is reallocated in the budget. LoCIP is up 300,000. Road aid is up 355,000. General fund aid is down about 656,000. So they offset each other.
Let me ask, Mr. Mayor, let me jump right in here, because we have the pages in front of us, and you started with state. Okay, let me ask a question, and then let's go from there. We have several different subtotals under state, okay? If everyone, I'm looking at this schedule, which is the revenue across the top, okay? And if you go to page 2, it's got several different subtotals there. It's got total state education grants, which is a very small decrease, $7,000 or so, right? state education building grants, which is about a $10,000 or $12,000 decrease, right? Then you've got total state grants. Now, it's unclear to me, does that include the education, the two subtotals I just referenced, or is it separate from the subtotals I just referenced? First of all, that's my first question. And the second comment I have is, regardless of whether it does or doesn't, there's a significant increase in the total state grants year over year in this subtotal on page 3. It goes from 4,523,000 rounded to 5,162,000 rounded. Yeah.
I think they handed out a newer
When?
form.
When? At break.
Yeah,
So
it's
what
the
I
same,
spent,
Right.
so when I spent time reviewing this afternoon is not what's currently in front of me.
There wasn't much that changed, except the one you have, the new one that's in front of you is color-coded, is the only thing, is one of the minor changes, is the major change.
If you go right to the line you were at, it's just a few dollars different.
Yes, it's, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So if it's
yeah,
a few dollars
so-
difference, thank you, it's still a significant
Right.
difference. So is state aid flat, or is it going up, or what's the deal here?
Okay, the gentleman's question is, this is budget versus the budget.
See what I mean? It's just that,
No, your question is very clear, and I'm sorry that I don't have an immediate answer, and I'm not sure why.
okay, do we want to move on? And we can go to other board members and get back to that one?
Yeah, so my point was, with respect to the total state aid from the town budget, from the state budget, should be flat. Everything I've read is flat.
Yeah, this one has it up, right?
This one has it up $1 million. And I don't know if that's, not $1 million, $600,000.
Yeah,
So there's-
666,000.
There's something that must be a transfer. And
All right. Yeah, Mary, I'm sorry. Mrs. Leclerc.
There's two lines that seem to have big increases.
right,
On page 3, if you go to local capital improvement program,
right,
and also,
Mary, move your mic down further.
right. The local capital, that's what I was saying, the local capital improvement program is up $300,000. The road, that's up $300,000. The general fund is down, and I'm not familiar enough with see, we don't have a dollar change column.
Because I was surprised, took note of it this afternoon. This budget would suggest that state grants are going up 14.72% year over year, or $666,000, and I was concerned by that and noted it.
Yeah, but where's the offsets is the question. What I was trying to say was, there's reallocation, there must be reallocations in the budget. The total is the same. I don't know where the offsets are, right off the top of my head.
Okay, could we just follow back up on that then? Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, do you want to walk us down this? or-
Yeah, so basically, the reason you have a color-coded document, if you go to page 7, there's the color codes are there. The aqua is from source documentation. That's lease agreements, government's proposed budget. In other words, those are numbers that are, except with the exception of one of the aqua numbers is the current tax levy. I mean, it's from a schedule. It's a schedule that calculates the number. But like, for example, lease agreements, the rentals from the parking authority, et cetera. So those numbers are pretty much the fixed number. Okay? The black numbers, the ones in black, were furnished by and in discussions with the department heads. So all the department heads, that's, you know, based upon the discussions and their information, that's the combined best estimates. And the red numbers are pretty much just kind of like the last 3 years actual, except where maybe there was incidences where there was 3 years where 1 year was, for whatever reason, higher or lower, and there was an anomaly there that was identifiable, then that outlier would have been thrown out. And then the green was, because there's 2 sets of green, one on page 5, which is the miscellaneous, if you will. This shows, this is something that's been carried forward from prior years. As you can see, the prior year's actual has been in the 130 range, but the budget every year has been 250. You know, it's something that the board might want to consider changing to, you know, to 150. And there's one other green on here somewhere, but I don't remember where. Linda, help me out there.
Page 6.
Page 6. Discontinued funds, which the actual, I'm not even certain what that is, but 12, it was 0. The budget, it's 75. The budget just got carried forward. So that's an item that is, it's, what is that? Remember, I looked up the definition of that. Does anybody here know, looking for help?
It's whenever there's a fund that's closed out for the year, if there's any surplus left in it, be it a special revenue fund or a capital fund.
Okay, so that number should be somewhat estimatable.
Yeah, I do too.
But that process has not been fully performed. So that number needs to be evaluated.
So there's green numbers on, what I'm hearing you say is there's green numbers on here that are just based on the prior year budget and are subject to change based on additional work to be done.
Correct. And the green numbers are that one number on page 6 and the miscellaneous revenue number on page 5.
Okay. Why don't we, thank you.
Excuse me, Tom?
Yes.
And also, Mr. Mayor, on page 2, bottom of page 2.
$50,000 state grant other?
Yeah, no, that should be a, that's a color coding problem. That should be an aqua. The idea here is to develop templates for the future as to how we're doing things. There's no current template that indicates that exists in the town as to where these numbers and how they were calculated in prior years. So we're looking to develop templates that make sense. Obviously, some of them, like the governor's budget's pretty straightforward. Lease schedules, pretty straightforward. Town departments, you know, is a 3-year history. You know, some town departments is people have a feel, but we're trying to document. You know, like conveyance tax. You know, it's like, you know, it's kind of, you talk to Jim Giller and Betsy Brown, and you know, and you know, people make their best guesstimates, their best estimates. And then the others, and if anybody has any ideas or comments or as to what is better than a 3-year average, open to suggestion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Why don't we go through this and ask questions based on individual line items, please?
Okay.
I'll open it up to the board, and we'll start with page 1. Anyone? Mr. Mayor and Mr. Tetro, on the current year levy, just for discussion purposes, we'll talk about this more when we go and set the mill rate. What are you guys assuming for a collection rate?
I'll defer to Mr. Mayor on that.
Oh, can I, excuse me, we're still having a discussion on, simple answer. The reason that there's a difference between budget to budget, even though the state is constant, is because the budget from last year does not represent what we're actually receiving this year.
So we're receiving
Yes.
$666,000 more this
More
year.
than what was budgeted. Yes, sir.
Okay, what are we going
Right,
to do with
sorry
that
for that.
excess? Is that going into the surplus, or what are we doing with the excess?
I think that was part of the analysis
Yeah.
that was stepped through at the quarterly review meeting.
I don't remember that number, though. I honestly just don't remember that.
Yeah, we had, yeah, that's why it took me, but yes, that analysis did show,
For a couple of state, the
3.
video competition, the
Video,
municipal
I do
revenue.
remember.
Right.
Municipal revenue sharing, there was a couple of things that were
right,
over
the pilot,
budget.
the pilot program, right.
So your commentary didn't equal the schedule because you were doing commentary against actual versus budget.
Correct.
Right.
Sorry, it took me a second to pull that together,
Yeah.
or more than a second, actually.
This is Leclerc.
I was wondering if we could request for fiscal year 13, your current year best guess estimates, if you could give us the revenue that's come in year to date, and then what you estimate will come in for the rest of the year?
Just in the major line items,
For the
right, Mary?
major- yeah.
Yeah, not
For
for
the
every
major
line item.
totals.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's what we do with the quarterlies, but,
Right, but just so
But
we
We wanna
can
compare
can certainly-
gauge
the
it
budget.
compared
we
to the
can
budget.
certainly, I'd like to work with you, which line items I mean, like, for example, as we're stating, the numbers that are in Aqua are locked in stone, and
Right.
more or less.
How about the subtotals? Do the subtotals. Just very simply, where are you going to come in this year, and what's your budget for 14, right, Mary?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. For the current year tax levy, for the budget, the 2014 budget, and I said this earlier, we'll get into this when we go and set the mill rate, but just for advance purposes, what's the collection rate you have on that?
That interesting you brought that up. There's 2 items in the collection rate. There's a collection rate applied to people who's appealed their taxes, and there's a collection rate applied to the grand list portion for the remainder.
Okay.
The collection risk for the remainder, for the bulk of the grand list, is in there at 98.53%, which is 0.06% greater than was used in the budget for 2013.
Okay.
However, it is 0.032%, if I'm doing that right in my head, less than what Cinda's documentation shows it should be.
Okay.
She's showing 0.9885.
Okay.
So if you were to calculate the difference, if you went to the 9.985, you would have an increase in collections of about $870,000, which would reduce your tax increase, obviously.
Okay,
So that's something that,
we can look at when we get closer.
yeah, we need
And see
to
if
look
those-
at, yeah, because there was some inconsistency when the tax collector was pulling together the information off of QDS versus what was in the prior tax collector's spreadsheets versus what was in last year's budget preparation papers. So we went a little bit higher than last year's budget, but we didn't, I figured that would be something that needed to be discussed.
Okay, and we'll discuss that when we go and set the mill rate, right? Does anybody have any questions on that now? Yeah. Real quick for myself, since since I gave everyone the opportunity on page 1, prior year's levy, is there an assumed lien sale on there, or what's the situation there?
The prior year levy is that was an interesting one to think about because one, we had a tax sale this last year which reduced the outstanding. So from that perspective, you could say maybe the numbers should go down this year.
Yep.
However, our collections this year are up significantly. So we looked at that with the tax collector and just basically decided to stay flat. That was a joint decision. But we will obviously be continuing to look at that.
So the lien sale is reflected in the fiscal year 13 budget, or no?
Not in the budget, no.
Okay, so it's not in, but it's also, there's no lien sale anticipated in the fiscal year 14 budget.
That is a correct statement, sir.
Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 1 toward the bottom, looking at building permits, electrical permits, and plumbing permits. I'm noticing building permits, you have percentage change of 20.83% to the negative, and then electrical and plumbing are 32 and 39% to the positive. Can you explain that, please?
Most of it is and so obviously it's per Jim Gilliam, and we actually, did we bring, because we documented all the conversations, do we have that copy of that? I didn't bring my copy. But that is mostly per Mr. Gillerin, I'm sorry, continuing work from Storm Sandy. The Storm Sandy created more activity for electrical and HVAC type activity.
Can we go to Mr. Kiley? You had a question on this one. We'll go to
Thank
Mr.
you.
Brockfield after.
Mostly at the beach, obviously.
Right. My question, Mr. Bolito, was a follow-up on what you just talked about. I did some quick math on the building area. There's 5 lines at the bottom of page 1 and a couple on the top of page 2. And if my quick math is correct, year-over-year budget of 13 versus next year's budget, we're showing a general decrease of about $120,000. Some are up, some are down, that I can't explain. So I guess from my perspective, it would want me to ask 2 questions. Where we are year-to-date on the fiscal 13 building department revenue budget, and then in general, what's the basic reason for expecting $120,000 less next year?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just since these were done with Mr. Gillerin, it might make sense to hold some of the specific questions for Mr. Gillerin. But I think one of the issues was that the budget number here, I believe we're running behind that number in our actuals, and I think that the budget number here might have been overstated for building permits. If you look at the run rate for prior years, the building permit number for this year is relative to that. The other caution I'd point out, because it was something I had to get used to as a residential realtor, is that our building permit fees are not driven by residential real estate. Obviously, in the beach area, we'll get somewhat of a bump this year, but these are really driven by commercial real estate. If you remember in past budget discussions, when we've talked to Mr. Gillerin, he's referenced Sacred Heart, Fairfield U, Metro Center as things that would drive the budget from the building permit standpoint.
Yeah, we also asked for a specific listing, I think, of projects that they anticipated coming through. Does he have that listing?
No, actually, no. In fact, there was a listing from last year. Some of them came through, some didn't, and some that weren't on there came through. But I would, what Mr. Tetro said is correct, but with one exception. I think we should ask the questions, get the questions on the table. We can certainly be the conduit to Mr. Gillerin and bring because we're going to have questions at every meeting, I anticipate. And then we'll bring back the answers to those questions hopefully at the following meeting. And the following meeting, maybe start off with response. It's kind of like the follow-up that you have for your regular board meetings.
Sure. I think the point is that, Mr. Tetro's point is Mr. Gillerin's going to be here and can answer those questions directly when he's here, right?
He's
Yeah.
the one who came up with the revenue projection, so
Yeah, that goes to my earlier point. That's why, and I'm not trying to be a pain in the neck here, it would have been nice to get some verbiage to go through with this tonight,
Yeah.
right? Since this was the revenue night, right?
yeah. Well, I think with the building permit revenues, we've kind of always done that with Mr. Gillerin at his sessions, as I remember, but
All
I
right,
think for the major items, Mr. Chair, much like we did what I'm going to call it a key line analysis sometimes at the quarterly reviews in the past, if we can identify, and maybe we can identify that for the board, the larger revenue lines and provide that explanation in terms of what does going on ahead of time.
it's your guys' proposed budget, so that's what I would propose back to you. Yeah, Mr. Brockfeld.
Your subject?
Yeah.
Okay. Or back to one we were just talking about. I'm a little concerned with one of these numbers here, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Tetro. If we go to back up to prior year's levy for a second, so you guys are saying that, and I understand it's obviously never exact, but you wanted to hold that number constant after talking to the tax collector. But if you go down one line, if we did a lien sale, right, and that reduced the outstanding uncollected taxes from the year before, right, it strikes me as impossible that the interest can be the same in fiscal 14 because you're working off of a lower base and interest rates haven't risen, so we're not charging more interest. So I'm concerned that number, in other words, I can understand the 1,857,000, but I can't understand the 954,600.
Yeah, however, Mr. Brockfield, if you look at the actuals in 10, 11, and 12, 12 being the only year with the lien sale, is 1.4 million in 10 and 1.1 million in 11. So 954 is less than other years with lien sales, without lien sales or tax sales.
Let me ask a different question then, related. Do we have, and I think Mary raised a good question here, she knows where I'm going with this. It would be probably, and again, it's unfair now, you guys have already put this out, I'm not trying to tell you to go back and do all your work again, but if we had some idea of how things were going in fiscal 13 as opposed to the budget, right? For example, if you told me that we actually were looking to collect 1.1 million in interest, then I'd say, well, 954 makes some sense, even if with a reduced base. So I guess that,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? So I don't think we have enough information to either
Draw a
support,
conclusion.
to draw a conclusion, right? In other words, I see what you're saying, but I also, I'm trying to say is I don't see how you can have the same amount of interest with a much lower base. I don't know how much we sold off in the lien. That's part of the problem, right? I don't know, did we sell off 20% of our?
That's part of the problem with the whole process, not the process, excuse me, with the information and interpreting the information. We had a tax sale, but when the tax sale came up, we only actually sold $274,000 worth of property.
Say, I'm sorry?
Only sold $274,000 worth of property. Now, other property that was subject to the tax sale was sold. Was not sold. Was the taxes were brought current. Okay, so we don't really know which of those people would have brought their taxes current anyway.
No, but if we sold off 274, right, and if we had a certain number of people make themselves current, maybe because of the threat of the tax sale.
Right.
By definition, both of those categories are now off of the list of people who are paying interest, right?
Exactly.
So one way or another, we've drastically reduced, I shouldn't say
Base.
drastically, because I don't know what the base is.
Yes, but if you look at 2012 actual, which includes most of that activity, okay?
But in
Because the tax
2012
sale was in August, right? Or late July?
Yeah.
The actual sale? Okay.
Correct.
Most of the most of that activity that we're beginning current was in 12. And if you look at 12 versus 11, you're only looking at a $200,000 difference. So you're trying to, and which I've tried to do a little bit, but obviously with, it's interruptions from Storm Sandy and things, we've had some interruptions in the process here. But what the initial intent here, obviously, when you're doing a budget in a company or a corporation, when you're making things and buying supplies, you try to be very scientific. Town budgets here are more artful than science, I think. And that's why you have to look at multiple number of pieces of information, and then you have to draw your best conclusion.
Let me, and I
But
comment.
this is just math.
Yeah, that's, in other words, I think, yeah, I
It's
just
just
want to,
math.
Well,
I
it's
don't want
not
to be a
just
dead
math
horse.
to pick what you think the number is.
Well, let me ask a different question of Caitlin, maybe as well as Bob. Do you guys, and if you don't know, it could be one of these things we come back to at the next meeting, so I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you guys have an idea, based on where we are now, as to what you think the actual collection of interest will be for fiscal year 13 versus budget?
Off the top of my head, my recollection is that the prior year levy has already been realized year-to-date, 100%. but
Was
I-
that one of the numbers covered at the quarterly review? Did we have those numbers through 6 months at that point?
Yeah, I don't have it with me. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. The interest, though, I just don't remember. I mean, I've
And I
looked
don't
at it, but I
expect
don't
you to,
remember.
you're not a robot.
But-
So I'm saying maybe it's something Mr. Brown can put on his list. You've already done it. But,
Are you,
yeah.
Mr. Kiley, following up on this?
No, that was my question, just where we are with this year's run rate against the 954, just to kind of give you a ballpark feel for whether you're ahead of it or behind it.
Right.
That was it. Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Any other questions on this item? Can we make sure we get the Munis sheets, the next year-to-date Munis sheets, next time we go through this as well?
Yeah, we can distribute the muni sheets for the period through
Is January done yet?
through January.
January's not all in, but we can make sure it's in for the next meeting.
That'd be great.
Yeah, and get that out before the next meeting.
Thank you. All right.
And then I guess the other follow-up question is, now, the department head information, every department head comes before this board when they present their expense side of the budget. And we've also asked them to be prepared to talk about the revenue side when they do that. So the question, I guess, is, referring back to my comments earlier and Mr. Tetra's comments earlier, do we want to ask questions, make sure the department heads receive the questions and address the questions when they come before the board with their expense budget? Or do we want to try to ask questions and bring answers back prior? How do you want to handle that?
Mr. Bolito, you go, because
Thanks.
I'm going to say something I'll regret. You go.
I guess what I was looking for, and I think what we've had in past years to varying degrees, is to have a big picture snapshot of the revenue and kind of identify, all right, what do we need to be on alert with? What's looking really good? What's looking bad? Why is it? And then as we get into the individual departments, we can ask more specific questions. Obviously, we don't expect you to, or I don't expect you to, answer about the intricacies of the building department, for example, but I guess I expected more of a, high level, big picture, what do we need to be concerned about in terms of revenue? And, I have a lot of numbers here that I'm, trying to go through, but having that kind of top level, call it executive summary or something like that, like we have for quarterly meetings, would be helpful. So at least we can identify those things, and if we need to ask specific questions, we can do it when the departments are here in front of us. At least that's where I was going with it.
Thank you, Mr. Bolito. I'm going to go to Mrs. Albin.
Mr. Bolito's words were just what I was going to say. Would it be possible to have an executive summary? Because with that, there's much more meaning to all this information, and it probably helps us be more prepared as we sit here and might save some of the questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Albin. Anybody else want to comment on this? What I was hoping for was a bit, and maybe it's happened, I don't mean to besmirch the efforts that have taken place. It's just not evident that there's been a vetting process and that everybody is very comfortable with these numbers that are being presented before us. And I think an executive summary type situation would be most appreciated. And then to the extent that department heads come before us, we can ask specific questions to the department heads. It'd be great.
When we refer to a vetting project, I guess two comments I'd make. One,
I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm saying it's not
yeah, no,
evident.
I understand what you're saying. I'm just going to say, the total non-tax portion of the budget is $26 million, or a little less than 10%. And a significant portion of that is from the state and other areas, numbers that we know are solid. Like, those probably add up to maybe 6 or 7, or probably, the state itself is $7 million. Thank you, Linda. And then there's other rent schedules, like from the parking authority, et cetera, et cetera. So you probably got $10 million that that's for certain in the bank. So you're talking about $16 million. And that $16 million, the vast majority of that comes from the various department heads. Conveyance taxes is 1.2, 1.25 million, a little over that. The dump scale, which really is an in and out number, is 3 million of that. So you're really talking about, in an executive summary, which I'll do, and I'll bring something in, but you're really talking about, department head or department information, beach stickers, $700,000, beach parking, $250,000, boat dockage fee, $524,000. When you get through the numbers that you're pretty confident about, you're not left with many numbers or a large amount that
How much are you
is
left
variable. And that's what you're asking for.
How much are we left with?
Right, that's what you're asking for, is in a summary, and that's what I'm saying. I'm just kind of outlining what I think is what you're looking for, that we will bring forth.
We're looking to understand the assumptions behind the revenue, including the tax revenue assumptions, such as the collection rate, such as the grand list, such as the lien sale, such as the interest expense on the taxes, such as the interest income being assumed on the investments, such as what's going on with fees. Are we expecting the other bodies that we don't have any control over to raise their fees? We had a conversation over services here earlier. We provide services that people get raised fees on. Sometimes those fees are considered not to be market rate. Sometimes those fees are raised every 2 years versus every 3 years. What are the expectations on those fees? I understand it's not the majority of the revenue, but as you yourself point out, it's, $26 million, of which maybe 16 million of it is different than the 10 million that's accounted for, right? So we're looking at like 15 million, right?
Probably the 10 million probably is what we're looking
10
at.
million. Okay, what's our tax increase? What's our expenditure increase this year?
17 million?
Right, so this is $10 million worth of fees. I think it's material that we understand what the assumptions are and, over those fees. That's just me. Do others have a different view?
Yeah, and like I said, those numbers, that 10 million has been, and each department head has their rationale. What we haven't done is brought forth a document that explains all the rationales.
And that's fair, and that's the problem. I'm not saying the work hasn't taken place. It's
No,
not
I
evident in
understand.
the
I understand
discussion.
frustration, totally.
Yeah. Is anybody else, am I out there by myself, or do others agree? All right. Do people want to move on? Yes. Okay. So that's, any other questions on revenue? Or any other specific follow-ups? Mr. Brockfeld, did you want to talk about interest income at all?
Yeah, I will, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to jump ahead a bunch of pages.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to offer Mr. Mayor in particular some appreciation, because I think the number is getting much more realistic, and I don't want to get too technical, but it's getting more in line with what's going on in the marketplace, because if you remember, one of the things we did, I think Mr. Kiley was responsible for this, correct me if I'm wrong, we asked to have two separate lines as opposed to one, because the way the town accounts for this investment income is kind of interesting. It was new to me, coming from the private sector. We earn interest during the course of the year. I suppose we book it on a monthly basis. I'm looking at Caitlin. And then at the end of the year, fiscal year, we have to take a one-time, either a one-time year-end adjustment. They call it a fair market value adjustment. In my business, it would be mark-to-market. And one of the things I'm working, actually I shouldn't say myself only, although I'm in charge, there's a committee of you, myself, and Mr. Brown, which has been working on and off with Mr. Mayor, and a lot of things have happened, the storm and so forth, but hopefully we're going to make progress. But I think he recognizes that some of the securities in there have too much price volatility for an account like this. So what you see, for example, is that in 2012, the account actually had a $400,000 positive fair market value adjustment at the end of the year, which sounds great, but it really isn't, because it's the wrong kind of account to have that kind of volatility. So the good news is that we sold off a fair bit of the stuff that did account for that kind of volatility. And in this coming year, Mr. Mayor and his team and Mr. Tetro have recommended a $600,000 interest revenue and a $100,000, I don't want to use the word loss, but sort of reduction, I guess, for fair market value, for a net of $500,000. And you can see that's coming down. Now, again, we don't have actuals. I know we're looking so far this year at we've given back some of that $400,000 because the markets have turned against us, although not all of it. So I guess I'm being long-winded. The point is, I think this is a better number. And it will be even better when we finish the work of our committee along with Mr. Mayor and put in place some sort of cash management system, which hopefully maybe when the budget's over we can dive into with both hands and all our feet. So I don't think this is going to be an issue in this budget. That's my point.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Brockfeld. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your work on that. Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Same page, page 6, going down to the rental income. I'm looking at goose eggs for 13 and 14 for a number of different leases. I might just be not remembering, but why is that again? Looking specifically FTC, miscellaneous, Child's Garden, Central, Post Tavern. There's several there. Also bleeding on to page 7.
Yeah, those are, it's consistent with the prior year. Those are rolled up into rental income town property, 42512.
So that's on a different line item, is what you're saying?
Yeah, it's the $266,000.
Okay. So are we not
It's the aggregate
breaking
of the
those
total.
out by line item anymore? Because obviously you got zeros and you have it rolled into town properties. We just have it on
Yeah,
line
we-
item for town property?
Basically, we break them out, we report them by individual, we track them by individual, but in the budget process, collecting the data and breaking it out, the time allowed, we just didn't have time to do it.
I mean, maybe I'm just remembering wrong, but I thought that we wanted those things broken out specifically because various members of the board, including myself, had questions specifically with respect to the FTC and a couple of the other ones. Am I not remembering this right, guys? Or, 'cause I thought we wanted that broken out.
Yeah.
There were definitely specific questions related to the FTC. I don't remember the specific conversation regarding the budget, but I do specifically remember questions related to Fairfield Theater Company.
Okay.
So, in other words, you're not losing your mind.
Okay, that's good. I sometimes wonder.
Well, I think, if I could add on, Mr. Flynn?
Yes,
I
please.
think that, it certainly makes sense for the miscellaneous items necessarily to be rolled up. I guess, Mr. Mayor, what Mr. Bolito is referring to is that I think in the case of the FTC, and I think it may have been remediated since then, I don't know, but they had not paid their rent or had been unable to pay their rent on time or something. And so if we roll it into one big line item,
gets lost.
it may get lost in
Yeah,
the shuffle.
I think you've got, if you look at this chart, I think you've got the actuals all broken out. I think the question is, the only two numbers that are rolled up are the budget numbers for current year and for next year. In terms of FTC, just for the record, they are current. They have been current since the new executive director came on board, so that has not been an issue. But in terms of how the budget's represented, we can certainly do that at how this board would like it, because the budget numbers or the rent numbers should be tied to the lease, and that shouldn't necessarily change all that much from year to year. FTC being the one exception, because that's a
Ticket sales, isn't it? Or-
ticket, there's a portion that they pay and then a portion by ticket sales, but the budget, frankly, as long as it's a budget number, we can probably estimate that and see where they are, because I don't think their numbers have changed that much year to year.
Are you good? All right. On the one item, I seem to recall something with the parking authority lease. Was there an annual?
There's been a declining rent schedule for
Yeah,
the
right.
land there.
And this is reflective of that? I thought it was going down more than,
It
this
can,
is like
I'm gonna-
20,000?
it
defer to
continues to go
finance on it.
down. But yeah, I think it's 460 this year.
I think
I
the,
thought it was supposed to go down, for some reason I had in my head that it was going down more at a higher,
I happen to actually be looking at their audited financial statements today, which has a schedule in the back, and this is consistent with that
it is
schedule.
consistent.
Yeah.
Does it eventually, how far does it eventually go down? It goes down?
Under 300,000.
Right.
At the end of the lease, which is June of 18.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on these line items while we're here? Mrs. Leclerc?
How come the cell tower leases are going down? Went down about 100,000,
Cell
90?
tower is,
Page 6 and
on the
7.
bottom three lines on page 6.
That's, I don't have no idea other than that is the lease amount, and that's what it is, and I can find out.
Okay.
please.
I mean,
Thanks. Any other questions on these line items? Mrs. McCarthy-Vehy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple specific ones, and again, I know we'll hear from department heads, but to take back, related to the scale and our dump, I know we have conversations, or you in the past have had conversations that I have listened to, and I know we did last year. I noticed the scale weighing line item is actually increasing, and I just wanted to take that question back to the department head, why the increase and what's changing there, when I know in the past there's actually been less waste going through, so that's one question. The other question is actually the line 42403 recreation programs, which I noticed is zeroed out. I'm wondering why that is.
I'm sorry, what page you on, what line?
I'm on page 4, 42403.
That's the revolving account, and the revolving account is down to a level where there isn't money to take out anymore.
Okay, thank you.
How much is left in there?
100 and, a little over 100. Linda says it's 101.
That would be a little over 100. Okay.
To
Yes.
follow up on the parking authority, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question, that was one of mine. If we could, I would actually ask for the documentation on that agreement, and just to see what the schedule is, and I know where we're headed, but I would love to actually see that myself as well. Another specific question about the fines for police parking violation, and I think this will be answered when we see the munis, but just how that's tracking with the actuals. Noticing that's up, and curious about that as well, especially with the Metro Center now, if that has had any impact.
Mike's been talking with the chief more, but there's a new traffic enforcement.
I think two things. One, the Metro Center should have minimal impact on that because we don't collect any of the fines or fees from over there.
goes to the state.
Right, meaning more that, has that relieved any congestion downtown and
It's,
caused any
relieve
lower fee?
congestion, I'm going to suggest no, because downtown is still fully booked. It did have a dramatic impact on the wait list, which I think is dramatically down at this point, per my last conversation with the parking authority. One of the issues on parking revenues, we've just, and you may have seen some of the articles in the various news media, that we've installed a new parking ticket technology for both day parking as well as parking tickets. The day parking are fees that go to the parking authority. That will help their income, not the town's. The parking authority, again, is a separate agency. It's not part of the town, so the expenses for operating the parking authority do not come from tax dollars and the town in that sense. However, because we have the new technology, we're able to use that on parking tickets, and that is going to, we believe, will improve our parking ticket fees that the police charge. So there's a day ticket you get if you properly park, and then if you improperly park, as I found out last year, you get a regular ticket. Much more expensive than the day parking ticket, I should point out. Yes, it is. All because you don't see those yellow lines on the road. I don't get it. All I wanted was coffee.
Yeah, there's also a new traffic enforcement division that they're writing more tickets, intending to write more tickets. I don't know what to say. They tend to be more, I don't want to say it that way,
No, they're more focused from
More-
that standpoint.
Involved.
more
And
focused. And
It's one of the
They clearly want the new HVAC system.
it's one of the functional initiatives that Chief McNamara put in place, and I know he's very proud of it. I know they've gotten a number of awards for what they've been able to achieve in terms of seatbelt enforcement, distracted driving enforcement, and it's a group of officers that are dedicated to helping improve the safety on our roads. So consequently, they're more focused, so they've been able to achieve some better results. And I don't mean that just in terms of ticket revenue, but literally a lower incidence of people driving without seatbelts and distracted driving. So I think that he'd be more than happy to fill us in on some of the details on that.
Thank you.
yeah, plus the handhelds that were introduced in the parking authority are also been introduced into the police department, so they're also doing more efficiently parking ticket control.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry. I'm not-
Well, I can defer. I have a few other specific questions. Okay. One of the other specific questions was about Penfield rental. And just wondering again what the assumptions are here, given that clearly the space is not available. So what are we basing this number on, or what are you basing this number on? And can you give us some idea what we're looking at for that? And that's on,
Mr. Lombardo was assuming that Penfield would be up July 1st.
It will not be available until July 1st.
So
okay.
it will be available July 1st, so
It
we'll
will
have,
not be available until July 1st, right?
right, but will be available July 1st, so there's revenue for this budget.
Third base.
You guys are managing to argue while saying the same thing.
No, exactly.
But in other words, so the
however-
expectation is that we'll have a full, in terms of the fiscal year, a full season.
I think that that may have been the assumption at the time these numbers were put to bed. I think that's one of the assumptions we're going to want to revisit with Mr. Michelangelo as we go through this process, and I think we will be updating that. I think July 1st is somewhat aggressive based on the schedule we have.
Okay. Last.
But again, best available information at the time. I don't mean to, when these were put together, some of those schedules were not as fully developed.
That work in progress piece that was referenced earlier. Just one other comment. I noticed in the rental income school buildings, I know with the Board of Education, there was conversation about working with the First Selectman's office to come up with a list, and I just am wondering, I'm sure you haven't had a chance to sit down and do that yet, but just to be clear that we're, on the town side, planning to work with them because their numbers have changed and assumptions have changed there. So just to confirm that that conversation is going
Whenever they want to sit down, we'll be happy to.
Great, thank you.
You all
That's it
set?
for me, yes.
Great, I'll go to Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, because I know it's getting late. There's a new line on page 4 called Town Dump Recycles Rebate for 100K. Can you just tell me what that is?
There's a new contract, but hold on a second. Hold on a second. Where is that? What number is that? That is 4235. 4235. It's not there. 42345. It's a result of a 5-year contract with Winter Brothers Recycling to rebate the town of Fairfield $20 per ton for recyclables process.
Simply put, we're changing vendors. And the vendor we have been using for recycling, we are leaving. And it's an initiative with a group of the towns in the region to go out and negotiate a better deal, and we've got a phenomenally better deal at this point.
Thank you.
So those numbers reflect a higher revenue because we're getting paid more for our recycling than we have in the past.
Thank
It was explained to me that Fairfield has very high-quality recycling.
Good garbage.
No,
It's one of our
recyclables.
services that we're going to be evaluating.
This is separate from solid waste.
I've been appropriately chastised. Okay, are there any other questions?
Good thing Mike Z wasn't here. He really would have taken you
Yeah,
to task.
exactly. He's a big man. Any other questions? I do have one, alluding to something that we asked earlier, or referred to earlier. What's been communicated, if anything, from the administration to the other town boards related to what they should be looking to do with fees for services rendered? What kind of discussions happen in general as they look at what they should charge for their services and what the expectations of their budgets are?
At this point, we've talked about a couple specific areas, like the marina. Over the past year, in the last few months, we have not had that discussion, basically due to some of the distractions that have come up over that time. It normally, as those topics come up for discussion, and a lot of these center around Parks and Rec,
Right.
Mr. Lombardo would initiate the conversation. We'd sit down and talk about what was being discussed, where it would leave us, and to your point earlier, kind of how do we, Mr. Brackfell's not here. I was going to use mark to market.
Right.
I think much like the analysis that the golf committee did, we sat down a year ago. Actually, I don't know if this group did. I did. Sat down with the chair of the golf commission a year ago, and he went through a complete market analysis in terms of the other courses they track, where the competition is, how they do it with residents versus out-of-town rates, and what their targets and goals are in terms of rounds played.
We had
that type of-
a presentation on that within
Okay.
the last couple of years.
That was probably the kind of best prepared process through that. Marina rates are one of the issues. Mr. Lombardo changed the hours with which we're charging for day parking, that type of thing, at the beaches last summer, though we struggled with having available help to man those booths, but we did change the hours to bring in some additional revenue there. So as they review those, we definitely have that discussion this year. And given Sandy and given Nemo, I just haven't had time to get back out and proactively do that.
So what, Mr. Lombardo will be able to talk about the assumptions that are baked into the budget as to rates, and when do those rates need to be set?
I believe the boards are, there are certain rates that need to be set in time for a given season.
That's what I would assume, right?
All right. That varies a little bit by the sport, board, or game. So let me follow up with Mr. Lombardo and see where we are.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. Any other questions on revenue at this point? Please, Mrs. Alban.
There's a number of line items that would be helpful on some of the fees charged for some of the items on pages 4 and 5. Is it best, Mr. Chairman, to submit these questions, should they go to the First Selectman's office for backup detail? There's no need for me to run through them tonight. They may not have the answer. Case in point, I'm just looking at a number here at the bottom of page 4, and we have par 3 season tickets at $100. I'd be interested in what a season ticket cost. That's in that same vein. I'd be interested in some of the other fees in that same regard. I didn't know we had season tickets to the par 3. So I don't need
Like
to.
nobody else does either.
I don't, because I'd be buying one. At that price.
You
that's-
might want to check the economics.
Well, if that's more than one person, probably it's a pretty good rate. But so I could send these questions
Please.
to your department,
Here's
your
what we
office?
should do.
Because there may be others as I look
Yeah.
at this document, and
Let's do this protocol just so that we make sure we have everything covered. Let's send
Send
the
them to you?
questions to our clerk and copy myself.
and then you can forward
And
them
we'll
to the
forward
right
them
people.
along. Do you want to be copied on the secretary? And
Okay.
Mr. Brown, and if someone gets forget, we'll just share them amongst each other, and we'll
Yes.
forward them along appropriately. Does that
I know
work?
as I look through this whole document, there are questions, and it's probably
Yeah.
easier to send them to you that
Yeah.
way, and you can disseminate
Mr. Chair, if I
them.
might?
Yeah, please.
If a number of these relate to something like the rec department, as it sounds like some of these are, do you want to wait till the rec department night, or do you want us to arrange for Ms. Lombardo to come here before that to discuss specifically these revenue items?
Let's wait for him to come until the rec department night. Okay, but if he's got written answers to the questions beforehand, he can shoot them back to us. Okay?
Certainly.
If they're one-offs that he can just
Fine.
bang answers out to, and then to the extent that we need additional follow-ups on the night he's here,
Wait,
as opposed to bringing them out yet another night.
thank you.
Does that work? Great. Thank you. Anybody else on revenue? All right, seeing none, we'll go to fund balance analysis, which we alluded to earlier. I mean,
If I may, Mr. Chair, just kind of a one flashback I was having here when I joined this board way back when, 2003 or something. As I'm sitting here fielding all these questions that I don't know the answers to about revenue, I remember at that time, revenue was not even discussed as a board, and I remember I was the one that initiated, that the Board of Finance should be looking at this.
hey,
so-
Bob, it's a circle of life.
Circle life. So I think I'm looking at this with a little bit of mixed blessings tonight and mixed feelings. But other than that, I think all the questions are pertinent and good, and we'll certainly get back to you on the various issues. I actually did, with respect to your idea of a summary, there was an attempt to start that. We just didn't have time to finish it. But that's a real good idea, and there's nothing in the history books. Apparently this didn't happen in the past, but that's no reason not to do it. But so we will get that out. We'll get the answers out with written answers from departments on line item issues where they have them, and non-department items. I know Jim's been taking notes. We just, make sure, and Ms. Bossi's been taking notes, and we'll get those out prior to the next meeting.
Thank you very much. The fund balance schedule. Everyone has that in front of them. They know which one it is. Do we have questions, comments on this one? We talked about it a little earlier. The first selectman pointed out that there's a $925,000 supplemental contribution that's included in his current budget. And it also reflects the $500,000 additional contribution we put in the budget year we're currently in, fiscal year 2013. Do we have I'm trying to figure out how to say this. I don't see the long-term path on how we get closer to the 10%. Number one, do we need to get to 10%, or is it 8%? Number two, what's much like we did with paving, OPEB, pension, things like that. What's the longer-term plan here? Provide some context to us as to where we think we're going here, if you don't mind.
Let's take those one at a time, since there's
There's like
several
13 there.
several questions
Right.
within that. I think simply, the rating agencies don't come out and give you a number.
Right.
You say, what do we got to get to? They're like, you need more. You need more financial flexibility. They talk in loose, general terms. As you talk to the other towns and you sit around, you find out that everybody gets pushed towards that 10% number. You see that we do have some documentation that said the average unassigned fund balance for AAA towns in Connecticut was 10%. So that kind of gives folks a target in terms of what they're heading to there. But, Mr. Chair, and I think we've had some one-on-one discussions about this over the last few years, not just recently, that 10% is a nice number. There may be a price you pay for getting there, and we may not need to get to that 10%. That if we had an 8% fund balance right now, and let me use last year's numbers because the math works a little better. And 272 million, 10% would be 27 million. Knock 6 million off of that 22 million, as opposed to the 14 or 15 million where we are. That would give us a lot more financial flexibility. Whether that extra 6 matters or not in terms of what we're doing, we don't get points from the rating agency from going from A to heck. Right now we're AAA and stable. One could argue we're not doing this anymore for just the rating agencies, so that's maybe a secondary reason, or a secondary benefit, I guess. We're doing it this because in a well-managed town, we should have more financial flexibility. And if we had it there, we could, as some towns have done from time to time, use that surplus. All right. Right now, we're at the point where technically to use it would put us in a situation below the guidelines that the rating agencies want to see us in as a minimum. So we're kind of have the money tied up there, we don't get to use it. So I think that's where we're trying to go from that standpoint. From a standpoint of the longer-term strategy, we had, to use your terminology, several tactical goals over the last 18 months. One was to get rid of the negative outlook and get our reserves back to the point we could do that. Second was to get an arms around what was taking place with the Internal Service Fund as well as the surplus, looking at what, if any, and certainly we've seen some surpluses fit into our operating budgets, so to know what additional supplemental contribution would be a reasonable number. We've kind of put the additional supplemental contribution at a level that if we break even for the year, that will keep us ahead of the game or ahead of the 5%, so we keep moving up, as you pointed out, nominally so. But if we get some positive surprises, we're able to take advantage of that moving forward. The next step would be to put that longer-term strategy in place, as we did with the ARC and with OPEB, to have that. So that is the next step in terms of where we're going.
Is there a time frame to do that, or what's the plan to take that next step? You know what I'm saying?
I think to have that in place for the next budget year would make sense. I mean, we need to have that as part of our planning going into the next budget in terms of where we are. Right.
Any other questions on this item? Yeah, Mr. Buckler.
It's not really a number question, it's more of a conceptual question, which is, and by the way, I think it's excellent. I know, Mike, you were actually involved when you were on the board in as you mentioned before, in trying to build this thing up, and we're trying to get back. I guess the only thing that concerns me a little bit on this is that in the absence of some sort of, I'm sorry, if some sort of hard instructions from the rating agencies, it strikes me that the problem with this balance and where we can get in trouble is that, okay, we have a first selectman now who's speaking about how he wants to build this up and to improve our situation, but in the future we may have a first selectman who doesn't feel that way. And so I guess my concern, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you.
You know where I'm going with this? Is that,
I do, and that's one of the reasons why, to get a program in place, much like we did with OPEB or
that's exactly
paving.
where I was going with this. Is,
Right,
is,
and
is,
it's
is
a
it,
programmatic thing.
Is it, and
as
is it the
opposed
place
to
of the Board of
once a year.
Finance to, we probably don't have the power to, insist on something, but do we have a place where we should be making strong recommendations from our table as to where we want to go with this. Because, for example, last year we were concerned about the pension fund and about how much was being put in, some of the changes that were made. I don't want to relitigate that, but we chose to put in more than the ARC, right, because we were concerned about that. I think that was a strong statement from this board as to where we wanted to go
Yes.
with the pension contribution. So, you know, so at the same time that I'm saying I'm pleased to hear that we have somebody at the helm who understands the importance and wants to build it, I'm concerned that there's no policy. That's the point.
Right.
Right, there's no policy.
Yeah.
It's more arbitrary.
I wouldn't so much say arbitrary. I think what we're doing is putting that foundation in place. You take a look at where we've come. Let's see, you're one of the youngsters on the board.
Thank you.
But us old-timers, remember when we were actually, there was a line item in the budget book that said use of surplus to fund operations to the tune of $2.5 million. We had to stop using the surplus. We were running a deficit budget for the first few years we were on board together. First thing was to stop that. There wasn't a line. Last year when we decided to build this up, and again, to use the current terminology, a bit more tactical, saying that we're not sure how we're going to end up, but we want to make sure that we build a surplus component into this. There was no line in the budget to put it there unless we just put it in general contingency, and we didn't want it perceived as just general contingency to be used whenever we wanted. So we put a line in the book called surplus, supplemental contribution to surplus. So we started and built a framework for that. The next position is taking a look at, balanced, unfortunately, with our tax situation, how much can we afford to tax in any one year to do that? As we get our arms around the drivers and look at where we have a little bit more flexibility, hopefully next year, we can also start to put together we can see what the 925 means. We'll have at least 2 years' worth of history, from my standpoint, of where we've ended up the end of the year. You saw that this year we had a number of what I'm going to call cleanup items to do as part of the budget. Hopefully those will be a lot fewer this next year and get to a more stable environment. So putting together that plan, to me, makes sense going into next year. That's the next break point we have to impact that.
And to your point again about policy, is I think the auditors, one of their recommendations was that we put in place a policy relative to the fund balance. And in fact, Mr. Senafani has forwarded something to me, which I have not had the opportunity to forward along with you, to you guys yet. I just got it. Relative to what is our policy going to be on fund balance. And to your point about our board, if it doesn't originate here,
Right.
we're certainly a key player,
Right.
in my opinion, in our opinion, I think, of driving that forward, much like we were with OPEB and with some of the other.
Even though it's not necessarily related, what comes to mind is the paving policy we came up with, right?
Yeah.
We saw something that we thought was a shortcoming in the way we were handling our budget. I'm not claiming we have a shortcoming. And we made a pledge to improve it, and in a scheduled fashion. So I guess I'm just raising the question as to whether, I mean, we could talk about this more, maybe Mr. Senafani's memo would have some relevance to this.
Yeah.
But if we really do think, and I think Mike brought up another excellent point, which is that one issue is the rating agencies, but the other issue is our own self-interest in terms of our flexibility to deal with, you know, in a way, it's kind of funny because you have a surplus that you're afraid to touch. It's not really a surplus. It's more like, you know, the Holy Grail or something, right? It's, if you actually have a real surplus that's large enough that, God forbid, you needed to use it, it'd be nice if we had enough of a cushion that we felt we could tap into
And I
it.
think that's where you get to. And let's take two recent case studies. A couple years ago, when the kind of crunch hit, Westport actually used, I'm going to say $2 million, if I remember correctly, of their surplus to intentionally lower their tax rate so they wouldn't take the big hit at one time. Great, they had the surplus, they were able to use it. The rating agencies thought that was fine. West Hartford, another example, last year, due to Alfred, which kind of missed us but hit everybody else in the state really bad, that Halloween snowstorm, they used their surplus to help with the expenses and damage caused by Alfred and got dinged with a negative outlook. So it's part and parcel. It's not just the surplus, because there are pension issues that Westport doesn't have that West Hartford does. It's
It's part of the greater foundation.
the rating agencies really take a holistic view and don't just give you the formula. Here's the checklist. Do these 10 things and you get to the next level.
But I think we're saying the exact same thing. We're starting to add to this now, and it'd be nice to know that we were working towards an end goal, and we were progressively improving to get there. which I think is what we all want.
And we've set up the structure to allow that to happen within the line items in the budget, which we didn't have previously.
Any other comments or questions from board members on this? Anyone, any of our colleagues on the Board of Selectmen? All right. The next item, last item for the evening is debt service. Mr. Mayor, can we just presume that this is a calculation based on our current obligations?
Yes, sir.
There's no assumptions built in here about refinancing or any savings or negative surprises?
Correct.
Any questions, comments on this item by anyone? This is based off the latest waterfall estimates and everything that's been approved by the town bodies. Okay. Anybody else? Seeing none, that was the last item on our agenda for this evening. Does anybody have
And
any?
very well handled.
I think I beat Mr. Bolito on that one.
Do we have Lou Rawls?
I think that's a record.
Do we have Lou Rawls as the
I was thinking Barry White, actually.
CFO over there
Yeah.
tonight? My God.
You
the
sing for us,
voice.
Bob?
Please don't. All right, do we have any other questions, comments, concerns from board members on any other items? We have our follow-up items for this evening. All right, do I have a motion? Mrs. Albin, do I have a second? Mr. Brockfeld, all in favor of adjournment? Opposed, abstentions? We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.